Most teams don't fail because they lack talent. They fail because they're not having necessary conversations. Think about all the meetings that you've been in, and I have certainly been in some, where everyone kind of nods and agrees and leaves, only for nothing to actually change. Or worse, where the real conversation is happening afterwards in the hallway or on a messaging platform or behind closed doors somewhere. And today's guest, Gustavo Razzetti, argues that this phenomenon is much more than about bad communication. He calls it conversational debt, the hidden cost of avoided tensions, unspoken concerns, the decisions that never really get made. And the interesting part is that we assume that people stay silent because they're afraid to speak up. And I'm sure there's some truth in that. But Gustavo's research also suggests that something far worse is going on. People are staying silent because they don't believe speaking up will matter. And that sense of pointlessness erodes trust, it kills momentum, and it keeps even the smartest teams stuck. In his new book, Forward Talk, Gustavo lays out a practical approach for turning conversations from something we avoid into something that actually drives progress. And today we're going to explore why teams get stuck, why psychological safety may not be the full answer, and what it really takes to create conversations that move both people and organizations forward. I'm J.R. Lowry. This is Career Sessions. Gustavo, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we're going to dive right in. You've got a new book out, which talks about teams. And I know you argue that teams often don't fail because they have a lack of talent, but because they're not having the right conversations, which is a pretty bold claim. Would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the conversations that we're missing in our teams.
I'm talking about strategic conversations, right? Not the coaching, the how to communicate clearly and so on and so forth. My focus is on teamwork. So there are conversations, not one-on-one, but collective conversations. And what's missing is basically the difficult conversations, the topics that we don't want to address, the different perspectives. Sometimes we look that we are aligned. We look that we're all on the same page simply because we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to upset our manager. We don't want to look like, hey, you're not a team player for speaking truth to power or challenging the status quo. But then those conversations that are missing at some point are going to explode.
I think you make the point that these conversations compound over time, right? In a non-linear kind of fashion, that there's a bit of exponential growth to them if you let them linger for longer.
There's a phenomenon that most people, I work a lot with teams in workshops and consulting, and they always have the illusion that things are going to go away magically. When I have a one-on-one conversation, everyone knows what's happening, but then when they get together in the room, no one wants to address those issues. I call this compounding effect conversational debt. It's like, okay, we're making some money, maybe I overspend, maybe you go out for dinner too frequently, and we say nothing's going to happen until the credit card statement comes and we see that debt starts to pile. The same happens with teams. No? We think, oh, it's not a big deal, but when you have not a big deal one after the other, then it becomes a big, big deal.
That phrase, conversational debt, really resonated with me, and I think it captures the essence of it perfectly. As I think about my own experience working in the corporate world for several decades, when you have those situations where people just don't talk about the things that are really necessary, right? The elephants in the room or whatever you want to call them, it just gets worse and worse and worse to the point where the team is, for all practical purposes, even if they're getting along, it's kind of a dysfunctional team.
The best way to address conflict is when it starts. And the next best moment is now. So the more we keep waiting, the more it's going to go out of hand. And I think that we have that fantasy that a conflict disappears, and it doesn't. I work with leaders that don't want to have those hard feedback conversations with team members because they don't want to go through that tense conversation. They don't want to go through that moment in which people get upset, or maybe they're not going to like them as leaders, whatever. But I always tell them the person that's having some kind of a performance issue knows. They know that you are not happy. They know that you're looking at them like frustrated. So they're waiting for that conversation to happen. It's like a couple that are going through a rough patch and both know that they need to sit and say, hey, how are we going to relaunch our marriage, our partnership? So someone has to go first.
The thing that I thought was more of a bold claim. I guess I know I used that phrase a minute ago. You make the point that people often don't speak up, not because they're afraid to speak up, but because they don't see the point. I mean, that's like dark in a way that people have just, in essence, given up on their teams.
It is dark, but it's also clear and it gives us a different kind of path. The point is when leaders say my team is not speaking, I always say, well, were they speaking in the past? So try to get when you started, the first meeting you had with them, did they share their concerns? Did they tell you what was wrong with the former leader? Probably they did. So people at some point stop sharing their perspectives, and this is because nothing changes. And this is very interesting because people usually think that people don't speak up because of fear, because of the culture. But I've seen a lot of cultures that are really nice, where people are happy, leaders promote and nurture a safe environment so people feel safe. But no one wants to basically rock the boat. They don't want to create any friction so people don't speak about. Yeah, your leader is going to listen. They're going to hear your concerns, but then there's no action, no change. It's like those employee engagement surveys that we complete every 12 months, twice a year, whatever the cadence is. But then after sharing, nothing changes. So what I would continue to raise my hand and share my opinion if nothing will matter.
For people who are sitting in a team, that gets to be a very frustrating existence, right? I can think of times where I've been there. You feel like you're talking to a wall, or you make a controversial point, or you bring up something that will create a sense of conflict and tension in the room. And then everybody else just kind of looks down and your peers sort of leave you hanging out there, right? And then it becomes not a team discussion anymore, but it's you kind of, and is the boss going to engage on this topic? Or is the boss just going to move on and change topics? And when that happens enough, they just change topics. You just realize, oh, what's the point of bringing these things up? They're not going to pay any attention to them anyway. And that's where I feel like you've kind of hit a person on a team who's just given up for all practical purposes.
And it's a paradox because it's like you're shooting yourself on the foot, because if you're not raising the issues, once again, those issues are going to harm you and the team as well. There's an interesting point on what you were saying. We talk about the boss. Of course, the manager plays a big role, and probably many of your audience are managers, but there are also people that are not in a position of power, but still contribute to this kind of defeat mindset. I always say agreement happens in the room. Alignment is what happens after. Because we can all agree when we're together, but then when we implement, are we really aligned into implementation? And those water cooler conversations with my team members, we start saying, you know what? I don't care about this. So we are feeding that darkness, using the term that you used before. So it's not just the boss. The problem is sometimes our own colleagues pull us down.
Teams are teams, right? You know, use a sports analogy. You can blame the coach on the sideline for everything that goes wrong in the game, but you know, there's 5 in basketball, 11 of you in a soccer football team out there on the field, the pitch. And if you're not working well together, you can't really blame the coach for that. And again, thinking about my own experience, have sat through meetings where teammates are really not carrying their weight of making the team effective. And even a well-intentioned boss is going to struggle unless they get that dynamic right. This idea of individual agency that comes with this. You've got to take some ownership. Even if you're a team member, you can't just put all the blame on the boss and say this team isn't working and it's all their fault.
We contribute both to the harm and to the solution. We're part of the solution and part of the problem, or part of the problem and part of the solution. And agency is a key word that you just brought up, because I think that people don't realize their contribution. So silence is contagious. When I'm going to raise my hand and then I see that no one's speaking, then I say, oh, maybe it's not the right move to make. When I facilitate in workshops and I ask a question and people start looking at each other, I say, oh man, there's something going on here. But on the other hand, when someone takes that action, they act with courage, they break the silence, they ask a question, they are blunt in front of others, they're also modeling that positive behavior.
And when that happens, it feeds the opposite kind of cycle. You can have a negative cycle that compounds debt. You can have a positive cycle that compounds interest, conversational interest, if you want to use the opposite of your conversational debt phrase.
I love it. Totally. And if you don't mind me asking, in your experience, because you mentioned earlier that you've seen those teams where people are shutting each other down by looking at each other like, hey, this is not the right moment, or we don't want to get there. what are the signals that you observe working with teams when the opposite happens?
It happens in one of a couple of ways. Either somebody in the right tone says, Mary, I know you were expressing some concerns the other day. Share those. There's a little bit of putting the person on the spot when you do that, but done in the right way, I think it gives them the confidence that you're going to support them because you've already kind of said, I want to hear what you have to say. I know you have an opinion on this. One teammate to another, not in the position of leader. I think the other way is when somebody does bring that up and somebody else then comes on top and says, I've been thinking about that as well, or that's an excellent point, or asks the question and just allows the conversation to get some oxygen in it. When it's just one person making that point and you get crickets, nobody says anything and people are not making eye contact, that's where I think it feels really awkward and where that does accrue. So I've seen it work both ways, but it's definitely harder to get that dynamic going, which obviously is the point of your book.
Sometimes we think that it's harder, but it's not as hard. There's this thing called the vulnerability loop, to a point in which the second person is as important or even more important than the one that starts the conversation. So I'm going to say, hey, maybe not naming Mary, but saying, hey, I heard that some team members had some concerns about the deadline, the timeline. This project feels a little bit that we're rushing it. It's too complicated. And then someone says, oh, yes, I heard the same. When someone builds on that conversation, then the rest say, oh, now we can jump too. So that second person plays a huge, huge role into building that loop.
Yes, for sure. So your book's called Forward Talk. Help us understand what you mean by forward talk and how it creates this kind of team construct that you're arguing for here.
Of course, we want, and leaders want, and you as a team member want to move forward. But the most important thing is teams get stuck in conversations because most of those conversations are focused on the past. We have, for example, one pattern that's blame. When all of our conversations are about that bad hire, the bad decision the team or the leader made, or a project that went wrong, or maybe we never completed it, or we had to redo it, whatever the case, that blame drags people into the past and we cannot get over. So rather than focusing into how can we improve from that mistake, what have we learned, we get stuck into who screwed up. Avoidance is also the same because building on our conversation, nothing happened in the past, so I stop caring, so I'm going to keep myself silent or I'm not going to really speak up my mind, I'm going to just to adapt. And the other pattern is groupthink. And it's the most deceiving of all because it looks like we're moving forward, but we're just moving on. We just want to go along with the team. We want to agree. We rush decisions without having the proper conversation. We're dancing around the issues simply to being a team player or just to, let's move on. That's why decisions never stick. So forward talk, it's about conversations that not only they focus into moving into the future, making progress, but also we do that by addressing the real issue, not ignoring it, not tackling it superficially.
You talked about groupthink perhaps being the one that's most deceiving because you think you've got agreement, but you really don't have agreement. Which one do you think happens most often?
It all depends in the type of culture. So in cultures that are more nice, groupthink is the one that you see the most often. In cultures that are driven by fear, blame is the most easy pattern because when there's fear, someone's going to get punished. So we would rather not be the culprit. We find someone else or even another department to blame.
You also feel that psychological safety isn't necessarily the answer.
I've been working with psychological safety before it became a thing, following Miet Bonson's work. For over 8 years or more, I've been training people, facilitating stuff. But going through the research of my book and also working with teams, I realized that it's not a complete solution because psychological safety focuses on the context. So we need to create a safe space for people to speak up. And there are two things that are happening. First, as we were mentioning before, there are companies that are safe, but still that doesn't mean that they want to hear the truth. They want to hear the perfect truth, the illusion of alignment. But second, the concept of psychological safety has become a little bit of weaponized, both from leaders and team members. And I have a lot of team members saying, you know what, this team is not safe, so I'm not going to speak up. And they use it as an excuse because in the end, they're part of the problem. So they're not doing anything to change it. They're using the excuse that it's not safe enough, and then they are not accountable.
I think that's a really fair point. A lot of things, they end up getting taken too far and used in a way that ultimately is not constructive. And certainly the concept of having a team environment where people can speak freely, share opinions, be vulnerable, bring up conflict if that needs to be brought up, say the unpopular thing.
Yeah.
All of that's important. At the same time, I have seen situations where people have said, well, I don't really feel psychologically safe, so therefore they're just casting blame on the system as a defensive mechanism, exactly what you said.
Yeah, removing their agency, right? So the point is not with the framework, is how the framework has been turned into something that basically is not helping some teams. But also, there's an additional layer. In my research, I identified like 3 groups, and there are people that are susceptible to psychological safety. So if the environment is safer, they tend to speak more. If it's unsafe, they speak less. There are the team members that regardless if it's safe or unsafe, they don't participate. And then there are the people that even in unsafe environment, they speak up because of their personalities.
So for somebody in our audience who's listening or watching and is having their own team experiences like this, we talked a little bit about being that second voice and the powerful effect that that can have. What are some of the other ways that a team member sitting in one of these meetings can help turn the conversation in the right direction?
There are 2 things that come to mind. The first is becoming more aware of the patterns. As I always like to say, forward talk is like a direction. No team is perfect. So we're always going to have a little bit of blame. We're always going to have a little bit of avoidance. The point is not having those patterns. The point is when those patterns become the team's norms and we default to those. So we're always going to have better and worse days. But when we start seeing how the conversations happen through those 3 lenses, are we avoiding the topic? Are we focusing more in blaming people or other people or maybe even the customers instead of trying to solve the problem, focusing on the system? Are we trying to find a solution that maybe, for example, groupthink, it's about finding the safest idea instead of the idea the team really needs, because we want an idea that everyone's going to support instead of the idea that's going to be a little bit uncomfortable, but it's the one that we need. So this is the first thing. When you start noticing the patterns, you can start sharing that with the team members and say, hey guys, I think we're getting too much into this. Not judging, not finger pointing, but at least it creates awareness. The second and quick intervention is what I call reframing conversations. So many times we tried that and it's not going to work, or it didn't work in the past, right? Okay, how can we make it work considering that the conditions have changed, for example? So you're reframing it into an opportunity. We cannot make this decision because the leader is not in the meeting. Okay, what decision can we make with the power that we have ourselves? Or we don't have budget. Okay, so what can we prioritize so we make money or fund this project? Many conversations get teams stuck because they feel like absolute and they focus on a problem. Reframing the conversation is turning that obstacle into an opportunity, trying to see the other side and not getting stuck. You turn into a question to explore.
You've done a lot of work with teams. For the ones that you've seen that are really high performing, what else do you see them doing that really stands out, both in and outside the room?
First, it's important that leaders realize that their role is to facilitate, not dominate conversations. And that comes to letting go of what happens in the room, being more intentional about tapping into the collective wisdom, and also admitting that they're not right or they're not the only source of truth. I was writing an article about this in Mark Zuckerberg's AI version, so people can access the CEO 24/7. And that's built on the idea that the CEO is always right and is the source of answers. Well, high-performing teams, leaders are not in that position. They are in the position of curating the information through their teams rather than being them the ones who provide the solution.
You're hitting on a couple of things that really resonate with me. One is this idea that we're in this era where the idea of star CEOs really seems to be particularly prominent. And when you've got a star CEO, to me, that's a weak team because it's got a singular dependency on one person. Even if that person is legitimately a star, I mean, sometimes it's just they're so controlling that nobody else really gets any air to speak or to express their own opinion or to take their own actions. But the idea of the star CEO just works against everything that a team really should be about, which is a collection of people trying to achieve more than they would have been able to do if they were working independently.
Even if the CEO is a star, they shouldn't play the star part. They should let their team thrive.
I was just coincidentally listening to Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams. And at the very end of the book, he talks about the leader as gardener. And it was a good analogy I'd not heard before. Just this idea that you're tending to something, right? You are nurturing it. You are not growing the vegetables or the fruit or whatever you're growing. You are not making the flowers. You are tending to them. You are creating the conditions for your garden to grow. And if you think about it in that construct, you're going to play a very different role than if you're the controlling, top-down, micromanaging kind of leader. And that difference really stood out for me as a very relatable metaphor for thinking about the role that a leader needs to play if they really want to bring out the best in everybody on their team.
And that's the culture, right? It's an environment that you want other people to flourish. So you just need to nurture it, not take over it.
Let's talk a little bit more about the broader organizational context and just some of the things that I'll say exist outside of the team itself and the broader culture of the organization that are creating these conditions where people just feel like it's not worth speaking up, pointless or otherwise.
There are two takes on that. The other day I was facilitating a workshop and there were like 600 senior managers and I asked them, what's your stronger sense of belonging? So one extreme you had your team, the people that you work the most frequent with and closer with, or the larger organization and everything in between. And the vast majority of people say that their strongest sense of belonging and their connection was their teams.
Right.
So the larger culture plays a big role and influences a lot of patterns when it comes to conversations. But in the end, you can have a very toxic organization and still have great subcultures that are healthy or semi-healthy. And conversely, you can have a very healthy organization and have pockets that are really toxic or harmful or silent.
I'm curious to get your view in terms of the orientation of the individual to the team versus to the organization. Is one necessarily better?
Probably, but I want to think more of what's the natural tendency, because I think that leaders need to work with the energy. We're talking about the garden, right? If some tree wants to move in one direction, it can push, but they're going to look for where the sun is. So you shouldn't fight against that. That's nature. And nature is that we have a stronger sense of belonging to the people that we're closer with. So you get connected to the place that you live, the sport team that you follow, your neighbors, then your family, your friends. So the closer that community, the stronger that sense of belonging. So that's human nature. When we want to create an identity, especially companies that have thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of employees, it's very hard to make sure that everyone has the same patterns, the same agreements, they all look alike. Actually, by trying to do that, we basically erode people's uniqueness. So it's easier to create that connection and have stronger subcultures at a team level than trying to force one identity that's going to bring everyone to us. So we need to bring connecting tissue between those subcultures and the larger org.
I think about teams that are so team-centric, right? Almost to the point where they're ignoring the broader context, positively or negatively. I think that can be pretty unhealthy because it doesn't scale particularly well. And it could be that that team becomes very set on doing something which is misaligned with what the broader organizational culture or purpose is about. At the same time, I think it's unrealistic to expect people to gravitate more naturally to a big organization because they're not dealing with the 10 or 100,000 people that are in their company every day. They're dealing with the 10 people that are on their team. And how you balance that centricity, if you want to call it that, in terms of my centricity to my team and my centricity to the broader organizational purpose, I think is one of the hardest parts to get right in terms of having team focus, because you don't want them to act in isolation. You also don't want them to completely ignore the 10 people around them.
You capture it brilliantly. You don't want to impose your organizational identity. You don't want to isolate teams into their subculture. So it's a balance. In my book, I talk about the three key elements of culture, and those are basically the three key elements of conversation that are conversations about alignment, belonging, and collaboration, or I call them the ABCs of culture. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to alignment, what's our purpose, value? What are we in business for? What's the impact? Everyone should be on the same page. I don't care in which business you are, in which unit. But then when it comes to how we do the work, the collaboration, that's more up to the team to decide what's going to work for them. We talk about being innovative. Well, innovation doesn't mean the same for your legal team, your procurement team, your finance team, or your product team. So it's different. And then the belonging, that emotional side, it's a combination of both how leaders lead at a company-wide level and also how teams operate in their own.
You've worked with teams all over the world.
Mhm.
When you go in and work with a team that's maybe not where they should be or where they want to be, what do you see that tends to separate the ones that then head in the right direction versus the ones that just stay stuck?
What changes is they move conversations from their head to the room. A lot of people are building narratives around the team, around their team members that are really totally off. And sometimes getting that narrative outside helps a lot. I'm going to share a very basic exercise. One thing I call the team heartbeat. So as from the moment you join this team until today, capture all the highs and lows. Then identify what are the key events that happen on each of those. So that creates like a pulse or heartbeat of the team. When people share with each other, you start to realize that maybe a project that was limited in terms of budget and timing and whatever, for you was exciting. So you start to see how people react to different events. And when you're able to bring all those perspectives together in terms of how we perceive the same events, the same experiences, but through our different personalities and roles, you start to create a very interesting context for people to realize that, okay, maybe we're seeing the same movie, but everyone's getting hooked in different parts. And we love certain parts. Sometimes we hate all the movie.
In that exercise, I would imagine what's particularly valuable is seeing what do people agree on highs, what do people agree on lows. They're all bringing up the same situation, but they're seeing it differently. And then you probably also got some things where I thought this was a particular high that nobody else happened to notice, or a low that nobody else happened to notice. And that's insight as well. It helps you see different people's perspectives because you go into the room, you have your meetings, but then you all go off and do your own thing. And you're living different experiences day to day. You're only having that shared time every now and then. And I'm sure you see a lot of that in your work when you go through that exercise.
Yeah, and you said something that's really interesting. Imagine that, for example, the leader says, oh, this moment was fantastic, and then they realize that no one else cared. It could be either that you're clueless or maybe your communication skills are not there. So maybe the moment was great, but you make it about yourself. You want to be the hero in the narrative, not the people, and then people didn't like it. So there's a lot to learn from those kind of things.
You made a point earlier about narratives. We are forming these narratives. We're interacting with our peers. We're saying some things. We're not saying some other things. We're walking away from every meeting with a point of view about where people are coming from. And we have these opinions about teammate A, teammate B, teammate C that could be accurate or perhaps completely inaccurate. And unless you start to vocalize some of those things and test them and figure out whether you've got a shared view of reality, you run the risk that you don't. And I think that's where this idea of conversational debt, coming back to what you talked about earlier, can really pile up. Because it just means that the team is not really having a shared sense of consciousness, if you will, about how all of this really ought to be interpreted.
If you don't know what the problem is, all solutions are going to fail. So a conversation is the first step towards understanding what's going on. And I think that's why we fail. When there's silent and leaders in particular, but also team members avoid the real issue, people are going to fill the void with narratives. And in most of the cases, they're not going to be good. People start filling that void with lots of crazy stories. And then when we start a conversation that we fear, people say, oh my God, it wasn't that bad. And that's the realization that most people have. There's a lot of research that shows that the people that went through hard conversations, most of the time they don't regret it and actually felt that, oh, that went much, much better than I thought it would.
That's true a lot of the time, as you're saying, that you have this belief that if you bring something up, it's going to be this huge issue. And I'll say 7 or 8 times out of 10, it ends up being less of an issue than you thought it would. 2 or 3 times, maybe it becomes a bigger issue than what you thought. But if that's the case, then you really needed to have the conversation.
It's like overspending and don't want to check your credit card statement. I mean, it's going to be there. And probably when you open, say, oh, I thought it was even worse.
Yeah. And that's where the debt's really going to pile up. Not conversational debt, real debt.
Yes, sir.
So for our audience, what would you want people to walk away with? One mindset shift or one tool in their toolkit to help their teams be more effective?
First, the notion of regret. There's a lot of research from Daniel Pink that says that we don't regret what we tried, what we did. We usually regret what we didn't. So you're not going to regret a conversation, even if it goes wrong. You're going to regret the idea of, I should have, I wanted to, but I never did. The second thing is you're part of the problems. We talk a lot today about conversational agency. In plain English, own your part. Don't complain if you're not sharing your truth, if you're not asking the right questions. You're also part of that silent culture. You're also part of the problem. We need to stop waiting for someone else to do that. We need to go first. We need to model the courage we want to see in others.
And I think if everybody starts doing just a little bit of that, you start to get the different kind of compounding effect that creates some of the positive energy that you need to then help the team become even more effective, more willing to confront hard topics together, more willing to speak openly. That's what we're really all aiming for. That's what's going to drive high-performing teams.
And I know people are saying, yeah, you're saying this, it sounds easy. I'm not saying start with the hardest conversation. It's like exercising.
Yeah.
You have to build the muscle. We build the muscle of avoidance. Now we need to start training and start building the muscle of participation, the muscle of conversations.
So your book is out. I look forward to seeing how the book launch goes and how it does, and wish you the best with everything. So thanks for being on the show with me.
Thank you for hosting me, and thank you for the conversation.
All right, takeaways from the conversation just now with Gustavo. First, the biggest risk in teams isn't conflict, it's actually silence. Teams don't underperform because people disagree. They do so because people stop speaking up. And often it's not fear, it's the belief, even a deep-rooted cynicism, which I said was kind of dark, that saying something won't actually change anything, which is not where you want your team to be. Second thing is that unspoken issues don't disappear, they compound. This is what Gustavo called conversational debt, and it builds over time, just like interest would on a loan that you owe. Each conversation adds to misalignment, adds to frustration, and eventually these things turn into major failures that will feel sudden, but they really weren't, and they were completely predictable. Third is alignment is often an illusion. Just because everybody nods doesn't mean everybody really agrees. And getting real alignment is both a shared understanding and a genuine commitment, even when people initially agree. As Gustavo said, agreement happens in the room, alignment happens afterwards. And there's a big difference between the two. And finally, better conversations require courage, not just frameworks. The exercise he suggested, I think, is a great one in terms of looking at highs and lows and how everybody views that. But at the end of the day, for teams to really work together, there's got to be the courage to speak up, right? And that means everybody has to have that sense of owning their part, being willing to express unpopular opinions, to engage and challenge honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. Culture doesn't really change until behavior does, and that requires everybody owning their part. I invite you to subscribe to Career Sessions on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on YouTube. If you found this discussion enlightening, and I hope you did, please sign up for my membership community, which is called Pathwise, and my newsletter, Path Wisdom. Thank you.